that'll be enough of that. There'll be no cheering by the end, I guarantee it. I'd like to welcome all of you, particularly those of you who are required to be here. I will try to make this as brief as possible. I'll lay off some of the material I prepared. And then I'd also like to thank those of you who are here because you have a genuine interest in the Constitution. And it is an interesting document, and I'm going to be talking about a few things that maybe you haven't even heard much about, or some ideas that you haven't heard before. And then finally, I know there's a group of you who know that this is going to be the time that I finally say something that's going to get me fired. And if you note, it's being recorded, so everyone turn around and wave for the jury for the trial. Say, "Hi, jury!" I've been sort of pumping up the talk a little bit by suggesting that I'm going to critique the Obergefell decision of this past June, and I am. But before we get there, we want to lay a couple groundworks, and I want to have a conversation. With the way I run my classes, the way that I do my presentations generally, is I like to interact with you. I've got 6 hours of material here, and we can sit here until, I guess that would be, 3 a.m. or something. But no, what we want to do is have a conversation about some of these ideas and discuss what the Constitution is and how it has an impact on our society, and maybe more importantly, how it affects how we interact with each other while we're trying to achieve and pursue that notion of a good life. Now, when I think about all of this stuff, believe it or not, there we go. I think about fruit smoothies. Just like the rest of you, whenever I think about constitutions and people interacting with each other, I think about fruit salads and smoothies. So it is a little updated version of the tossed salad sort of melting pot idea. And the reality is, right, if you're a piece of fruit, you probably don't want to be the smoothie, right? You want to keep some of your identity. You want to understand and be able to exercise and express who you are. Right? In the fruit salad, right, you get to keep a little bit of your identity, but you're also part of a whole. Now the question becomes, right, and if you've ever had a fruit salad, you know that the raspberries never really behave. They bleed all over stuff, and the strawberries impart some of their flavor, and we know one of my hated fruits, the pineapple sort of takes over the whole thing and everything begins to taste like a pineapple. So even within a fruit salad, there's going to be conflict, right? And we need rules. And unlike fruits, we can abide by some rules. And we get these rules, at least as we govern ourselves, from the U.S. Constitution. Does anyone know what vellum is? Actually watched a show having it made once. Yes? It can be paper. Yeah, sometimes it's paper, right? Parchment is certainly paper. Vellum is animal skin that has been stretched and cleaned and prepared for writing documents on. And the reason that you use vellum, and vellum was used for the Bill of Rights, as well as for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, is it has a degree of permanency that mere paper does not. And I want to talk just a little bit about why we might have chosen a piece of vellum. Why have a written constitution? You answer to me. This is where you take off some of the load from me because I'm incredibly nervous. I've never seen an assemblage of mental talent in this room since Nino Maneo ate lunch in here by himself 2 years ago. Some of you know who he is. The rest of you should look him up. He's the guy that went on to Harvard. Help me out. Why do you want a written constitution? Why do you want to put something down on a piece of paper? You. Yeah, you. Yeah. Why do you want it written down? You don't know? Why would you want your professor to hand you a written syllabus instead of a syllabus that doesn't really exist? And he just says, well, no, didn't you look at the syllabus? And you go, no, because I didn't get it. And he goes, no, I read the syllabus on your behalf, and here's what it says. Why do you want it written down? Yeah.
So that there is written observable proof that cannot be changed by the
Yeah, you want it in black and white or black and light brown. It actually looks kind of brown on brown. But you want it written down. You want the rules to have some sort of permanency, right? So what's its purpose? What are the component parts of the Constitution? What does it do? I'm guessing many of you had AP Government. Some of you had sat through, I know Dr. Fleischman was talking, I talked about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution today. I know some of you have covered this. What does it do? I'll start pointing, and it's not beyond me. Yeah. No. No. I know he knows. What does it do? Yeah, right? It helps us define what our government is. And you get, what a snooze fest. Until someone's knocking at the door, right? They get out of a black Impala with plain license or hubcaps. They've got the mirrored glasses on and there's a big bulge in their jacket. Then you might want to know what's in here, right? I keep those people away by wearing a tinfoil hat. But some of you might be concerned that you want to know what your government can and cannot do, right? And we need this for structure. We need to know how our politics are going to interact. We need to know what is the rule of law, right? And you go, well, why in the world would a political scientist be studying the law? Because how we define the law is a political process, right? And that's what we're going to want to focus on. All right. So what about this notion of rights? What are rights? Somebody take a look here. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's a bunch of people protesting, demanding their rights, and who are they facing? The National Guard, right? The state, the man. I don't know what you kids call government anymore. But we want to know that our rights are recognized and that we as people are recognized as individuals. And I've listed out a couple sources of where rights normally come from or what we think about, right? God and nature. We can look at the Declaration of Independence. That these things are given to you, that they're not to be taken away. Human rationality. People sometimes argue that your rights and your liberties and your responsibilities vis-a-vis government are given to us by human rationality. Sometimes it's political elites, right? And one of my main critiques of the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be, maybe that's a group of elites. Just saying. Not unlike poor Nino, who's now been mentioned 3 times. Most of the justices either went to Harvard or Yale. Right? Most of them are over the age of 60. In fact, all of them are now. Some of them are well beyond being an octogenarian or 80 years old. Do they really represent you and your interests? I don't know. We might want to think about that. Maybe the voice of the people. Maybe some of you think your rights come from government. And in a sense, that's correct. But if it is true, then you don't have much control over these things other than the amount of control you have over government generally. And most of us think about rights as coming from the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's what I study, right? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Most of you have probably seen this picture. It's George Washington, the rest of the guys. What do you see in common? Take a look at the picture. Right? Legs. Yeah, we see legs. There are some legs there. There are nice white tights, right? Actually, it would be really nice to be able to walk around in knickers again. What else? Yeah. Yes, they're all old white guys. Why are they all old white guys?
Nobody else had the time to do that.
Well, there's a whole heck of a lot of truth to that, right? That's not the only reason, but clearly, go spend the summer in Philadelphia, leave your family, alone, leave your farm untended, and don't make any income. How many of you are signing up? Right? It's 100-some degrees, there's a cholera epidemic, and you've got the windows covered with heavy cloth so nobody can see what you're doing. How many want to be there? Right. So there's some truth to that, but they are all white guys. Why? Because at the time, that's where the political power was nested, right? That's where the political power was. Many of them owned slaves, so they could be away from the farm because they had the people back there actually working. John Adams, he's in there. If we took a moment, we could probably pick him out. He's right over there. When he's leaving his farm in Braintree, Massachusetts, his wife Abigail says, "Don't forget about us." Right? And he kind of chuckles to himself. They're white guys, right? But that's what we would expect in 1778. So what did these white guys do? Here's two more white guys. One of them, let's try this for it. Who is the one on the left? Here's a hint. He's about this tall. He had stomach problems. And he's the father, allegedly, of the Constitution. He's actually the guy that took a lot of notes, so everyone kind of said, oh yeah, he's the dad. James Madison, right? And he's going to loom large in our conversation here until we get to Obergefell. How many of you, this is for all the points you can ever get for extra credit in an honors class, who knows who that guy is? No. Starts with an M. Who? Yeah, so some of you should know who this is. Yes, it's Montesquieu. And he's an important political philosopher, as is John Locke and others. Montesquieu is important for things like the separation of government, separation of powers, checks and balances. And Madison, right, read Montesquieu. Montesquieu looms large in something we call the Federalist Papers. We're going to take a look at a few of those here in a moment. Some of the basic concepts that come out of the Constitution. One, it's a republic. This ain't no democracy, right? It's the trickiest question of them all, right? Is the United States, I used to teach the introduction to American government. The American government is no, it's a republic. And it's a republic for a reason. It's a republic because the people themselves weren't necessarily trusted, right? And you need to control the governed by having their opinions filtered through representatives. But the other part of this equation is we also don't trust the people in government. Right? And we were talking about this in my class today. I think I used the word evil. I broke the all-time record and said evil probably about 30 times. They thought that people were naturally evil and self-interested, but also because people would sit in government, they're also going to be what? Evil. Right? So we force them to check themselves. Just think about it right now. Right? President Obama walks down Pennsylvania Avenue, knocks on Congress's door, zzz, they have two, and says, cooperate with me. Right? Everyone's looking at their watch. Oh yes, there's a presidential election coming out, almost a year from now. What's the odds of him getting some cooperation from the House and the Senate at this point? What are the odds of him even wanting, in some sense, to cooperate? Unless he's going to get what he wants. It's kind of working. Right? It works by not working at all. Federalism is the idea that, I always like to think of this as, crap, we don't know what to do. We don't know whether to have one solid central government being run out of some central location like New York City or Philadelphia. We've tried some sort of league of states or colonies and hoping that they're going to cooperate. So instead, we go with this notion of federalism. And then finally, the notion of pluralism. Pluralism is a very simplish idea. It's kind of a flawed political philosophy, but it's the idea that groups can compete with each other in government, and by competing with each other, they're going to check each other and make sure that no one group can necessarily achieve political results that are going to hurt the masses. Well, in the end, we know that's probably not awfully true, right? Are all groups or factions or even political parties equal? What are the odds of the Constitutional Party winning the White House? How about the Green Party? How about the American Communist Party? No, it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, maybe in your lifetime, I don't know, but not all groups are equal. But here's the idea. We'll set up a political system that divides power out to a variety of institutions. We have people being represented by people in Congress, by people at the executive branch, by people at the states, and even, to a lesser extent, people at the courts. Okay. So, what's missing here? This is the actual text of the Constitution. What's missing? Yeah. Oh, yes, yes. Oh, everyone always says that. What's missing? One of the elements of the Constitution that probably all of you have heard about and probably even deigned to read parts of it. Well, who said it? Right here. The Bill of Rights. Where's the Bill of Rights? How many of you know that the original Federalists, right, these are the people who threw this together, said, you know, this Bill of Rights thing isn't necessary. And, you know, obviously we're not going to read this entire thing, but if you don't believe me, right, you can take a look here. Here's what Hamilton said at almost the very end of the Federalist Papers. These were a bunch of editorials that were published in magazines, mostly in the state of New York. He said, look, we don't need no stinking Bill of Rights because the government doesn't have enough power to take away your rights anyway. How many of you would like to look at Hamilton in the eye and say, you deserve to be taken off the $10 bill for that? Yeah, right? You go, hey, Hammy. His friends called him Alex. Hey, Alex, what are you thinking? If we do not write down the rights, then government, you know, whatever that disembodied noun is, then government could potentially take them away. Right? And a group generally grouped together, and they're not an awfully tight-knit group, called the AntiFederalists, came together and said, no, Alex, no, James, we've got to write this down or we're not ratifying the Constitution. And we end up with the Bill of Rights. Right? It's a compromise. Originally, the idea was the political process would take care of it because we spread power out. Nobody's going to be able to maneuver this system and be effective in usurping people's rights. And plus, if we don't even mention the rights, then government will never get the idea that it ever had the power to do things like regulate the freedom of press and regulate the freedom of speech. Is that what has happened? A little yes and a little no, right? I think it's funny too. If, right? That young man has a future. You should always laugh at some bloviating fat man on a stage talking about the Constitution. If John DeWitt, it's a nom de guerre for an anti-federalist, if he's right, and you got to write it down. Hamilton said, don't write it down, because you write it down, the government's going to think it has the ability to regulate those things. And we've got this sort of balance going on. I wanted to add one cute picture. It's always good to put a picture of an animal. So what are the Bill of Rights? What do they cover? First Amendment. What's the First Amendment? That's the amendment everyone likes to go, hey, this one. You know, unless your hands are on the warm hood of a police cruiser, then some of the other ones begin to matter. It's speech, press, religion, and the right to peacefully assemble, to petition your government. This second question is a little bit more difficult. What do they mean? We can talk all day long about the freedom of speech, but what does that mean? I mean, one would hope it means, at the very least, I'm up here, again, bloviating away, and the government's not going to come cruising in with a roll of duct tape and some of those wire tie things and haul me out of here again. All right, yeah, between you and me, right? Most of you aren't going to remember much of this, and I get that. It's kind of the way these things go. But one thing you should remember, all right, and there's a record of it, sure. The one thing you should remember is the word again is actually the funniest word in the English language, because you can add it onto almost anything, and it gets a cheap laugh. And that's what I'm all about. Cheap laughs in the Constitution. We have, right, various amendments that have been adopted over time that help the Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So what we end up here with, because the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists didn't both really lose, they both sort of half won, we have a system where we define our rights, and I'm not going to go through everything here, where we define our rights sometimes in a political process and sometimes in a legal process. Right? Sometimes we leave it open to the legislature and to Congress and to the states to define our rights. Right? Examples of this might be civil rights acts. Right? Some of the most important civil rights acts going all the way back into the 1870s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1971, 1991, all of these acts came from the political process, right? Protecting your rights against discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, and a variety of other things, not only from other governments, but also from private businesses. Right? The political process can be used to establish rights. Right? And in fact, the Bill of Rights is a product of a political process. I'm going to feel like I have to hold this for the rest of my life. Legal process. We also, oftentimes, right, and if I was to walk in here and it was a smaller group and I could get you to actually write down on a piece of paper, and I'd say, where do most of your rights come from? Oh, it's a Bill of Rights and law. Who gets to interpret that? Your response is generally going to be whom? Right? If you want to be really fancy about it, you walk around and say it's SCOTUS. Anyone know what SCOTUS is? SCOTUS. Supreme Court, I don't like of, I like O better. The United States. SCOTUS. That's where we think, because we've been conditioned to think about the U.S. Supreme Court as being the font of our individual rights. Okay, be very quick. Don't look. There we go. All right, so which of these pictures best represents the Constitution? You people back there who are in a sleep because it's hot and it's sweaty and you're sitting on a carpet and you want to go home, you. Which one? The doctor who's going to fix everything, or the monster who's going to muck it up and burn down the town? All right, who would you rather the Constitution be? The doctor, right? She's a doctor. She helps with weight loss. I found her on the internet. I'm working on it. And, oh my goodness, that's my wife in the morning. Oh, it's not. It's her in the afternoon. Which is it? Right? I hate to play light about this, but you're not going to listen to me unless I am a little bit silly as I would. I was called silly for the first time in my life this week. At least to my face. All right, and we talk about a living constitution. And what I want to get at here is a living constitution always a great thing? Right? We're conditioned, right, when we are little people, right, you wake up from your nap, you get on your off your towel, or what, I slept on a towel. You probably have real mats. I lived in Indiana. It was kind of third worldish. The floor was cold, which would be kind of comfortable in here. You're told it's a living constitution, and you're told to love it. That's great. What if the living constitution got made out of bits and parts of things that should not have been put together? Can you think of an example where the U.S. Supreme Court claimed living constitution and made a mistake? These are some of the cases you know from your AP government class. We can toss a few of them out that are fairly non-controversial, right? I heard one person on a recent podcast I was listening to defend the decision in Scott versus Stanford, better known as Dred Scott. Right? After I got done hitting my head against the wall, I thought, gee, it's good to have one person around who's defending the decision in Dred Scott until you actually read it, and he's using it as a living document to make decisions that it was never intended to make, right? Reading things in between the lines. We like it when it's the good doctor who's going to come and solve things. We don't like the living constitution when it shows up with a torch. Now, is this a false choice? Is this a false dichotomy? The answer is, sure it is. But we've only got like 25 more minutes, so we're just going to stick with it, right? There's lots of subtlety here. But I want you to think a little bit about the living constitution maybe not being the best of all things all the time. What's this? It's a protest. Anybody recognize that building? It's the SCOTUS Building. Right, you're learning. Very good. There'll be no whippings for you after the lecture. I thought we were in a British public school. Back in the 19th century. It's a map of the... It's not a map. It's a flag. And a protest out in front of the U.S. Supreme Court just a few months ago. What, pray tell, right? There are no words up here. What do you think was going on in June? Anyone? We don't care, right? Yeah, you do. You probably really do. Yeah, a case called Obergefell versus Hodges was heard and decided on June 26th, I think. I don't know, a brief mental blank there. So a little bit of brief background here. This is the substantive part. There won't be very many jokes here, so just follow me. Try to put up with the heat and put up with the fact that I'm beginning to sweat through the 4 shirts I'm wearing. And I'll probably short-circuit the microphone at any moment, and that'll be the 3rd time I've been electrocuted at Eastern Michigan University. Only one of them was for a capital crime. Yeah, I see. Yeah, you always got to throw some of those in to make sure someone's paying attention. So it's one person out of a room of like 500,000 said, what? All right, we begin with Loving versus Virginia. This is the anti-miscegenation case that came to us out of, anyone want to guess which state? Virginia. And the state of Virginia said, it's our interest to keep white and black separate. We certainly don't want them intermingling and having children together. The U.S. Supreme Court hears the case and says, no. You have no basis to make this decision. You have no rational interest, let alone a compelling interest, these are terms of art used by the court, to justify keeping people separated in a marriage on the basis of race. Another case that isn't so popular, but it is just as important, is the Blocky versus Red Hill. Gentleman tries to marry in the state of Wisconsin. He goes down to get his marriage license, and it's not that woman from Kentucky. It's somebody else. And they say, I'm sorry, you haven't paid your child support or alimony. You can't get married. And the U.S. Supreme Court said he has a fundamental right to marry. Okay? Follow that up with Baker versus Nelson. A case nobody in this room has heard of, I'm guessing. You know, the famous case of Baker versus Nelson. Well, here's what it says. Here's the whole entire decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. Appealed from the Superior Court of Minnesota, dismissed for want of substantive federal question. This is the first same-sex marriage case to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. They denied certiorari and denied hearing it based on the fact that they did not believe there was a substantial federal question. What has changed since 1972? Has the Constitution changed? Except for that night I snuck into the National Archives and changed a few things. Nothing has really changed. I didn't do that. Jury, yeah, you can convict me on other things, but not that, because I didn't do it. Well, okay, it was in invisible ink like that silly movie. Banner versus Evans. Romer versus Evans. A very important case in which Justice Kennedy, we know who he is. How many of you know who Justice Kennedy is and why he's important? Not all of my acolytes and minions. Put your hands down. You're very smart. You and I need to talk. Anybody know who Justice Kennedy is? It's an interesting thing, right? If I would have brought Justice Kennedy and said, "Meet my dad," and most of you go, "Yeah, he's old enough to be his dad. Must have had him when he was really young, but yeah, he's old enough to be his dad." I used to say Justice Kennedy, my grandfather, but that no longer works. And most of you would go, "Hey, why does he have a different name than you?" And it's a long story. He is the most powerful person, arguably, in Washington, D.C. Why? How many people sit on the U.S. Supreme Court? Quickly. 9. This is going to be very difficult. Hopefully there are some honors math majors with your honors math calculator. You can calculate this. If there are 9 people participating in the case, how many people do you need to be a majority? 5, right? You 4, stand up. Just stand up. No, I'm not going to do anything to you. All right, it won't be bad. You 4, stand up. Just stand up, Joe. Yeah, you 2 too. All right? So, no matter what they say, or no matter what they say, it's what you've participated. Everyone else is sweating and just wants to leave. Quickly, quickly. We're burning daylight. We want to know what he has to say. Why? Do these 4 people have a better take on the Constitution? Maybe, maybe not. Do these 4 people have a better take on the meaning of the Constitution? Maybe, maybe not. What about him? We know that he's going to make the majority. And if he agrees with this 4 or this 4, sit down. He gets to determine the winners and losers. This was the first case in which Justice Kennedy recognized a right. But he did it in a very strange way. He simply said the state of California cannot deny gays, lesbians, and homosexuals the right to petition their government for being discriminated against. And he simply said you cannot single people out that way. You can't say everyone has a right to bring a case about discrimination except for you people. Right? And this is before they started smoking marijuana in Colorado. Well, I don't know. Maybe they were doing it on the side. I don't know. He is also the author of another very infamous case and famous case called Lawrence versus Texas. And Bowers versus Hardwick would be its infamous brother. In 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court said homosexual sodomy is not constitutionally protected, and in fact, you can and may go to jail for engaging in that sexual act. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, this is a matter of privacy between 2 consenting adults. Very important stuff. What we don't see here is any support for same-sex marriage. Where did we find support? In the states. The states started to change. the evil saber-toothed states began to say, we're not going to wait for you, federal government. We're not going to wait for the U.S. Supreme Court. We're going to start changing our own laws, state legislatures, state people voting in a referendum, and also state courts, and constitutional amendments began to change. I'm no geographer, although I wanted to be. Where do we see most of the states that support same-sex marriage? Oh, P.S., by the way, there will probably become a time in 2 or 3 years where we won't even use that term. And if I'm offending anyone, I'm sorry, but it's the term of art of the day. Yes, I know it's a marriage. Just bear with me for a second. The Northeast, right? The West, right? The coast, and, except for Indiana, a series of traditional progressive states in the Middle West. Where isn't there support? In the South, right? Take a mental photograph of this map, because we're going to use it again here in a second. Here is public opinion. Now, I was ranting about this earlier today. Although I don't pay much attention to much, cannot remember a controversial, quote-unquote controversial political, social issue in which there has been such a drastic change in people's opinions in a very short period of time. You don't see this with race. You don't see this with abortion. You don't see this with things like the death penalty, right? A lot of those public opinions are pretty flatlining. Let's take a look here, right? And this is also broken down by your people's groups. Having just turned 50, I just snuck into Generation X, but I didn't have all the fun they had in the 1980s. And the other fact is I was boring. But let's look at the numbers, and this is only like 13 years ago, 14 years ago. The silent generation, right? Most of them are silent because they're getting pretty old. Born between 1928 and 1945, 21%. In a matter of 13 years, 38%. That's a relatively significant increase. Look what has happened to the boomers and the Xers, right? Fewer than a majority till we get to almost a majority and over a majority. And then look at your own generation. Close to 70% support. Now, there has been a dramatic change in this issue. One of those changes happened just a few months ago when the U.S. Supreme Court made its decision. Decisions were read from the bench. This is actually Mr. Obergefell not testifying, but participating in a news conference. It changed everything. Justice Kennedy said, and I quote, "The Constitution promises liberty within its reach, a liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons within a lawful realm to define and express their identity." Okay? He's giving you a statement about what it means to have liberty under the U.S. Constitution. And then he goes on to say that the Constitution, through the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, two very important components of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment, that provided equal protection and due process or equal protection under the law for formerly freed slaves, also covers people seeking to get married. Okay? That there's a fundamental right to marry, aside from what your sex is. All right. And then we get this, and this is where the sort of conflict potentially comes. This is near the end of the decision. He says, essentially, I get it. There will be religious groups who aren't going to agree with this, but their rights need to be respected as well. Okay? The dissenters, and I can send you this PowerPoint if you want to read some of this instead of reading the entire dissents. I will sum them up. The dissenters essentially said, this is not the role of the court. You should not be coming in making up rights that have never existed in the Constitution. You should just have let the states decide. Okay. The states were making the right choice, or a choice, right? Some of these folks probably disagreed with the policy, but are simply arguing, leave it to the political process. We don't need the court to come in and make this decision because the change is taking place. The court doesn't belong here. Let the process essentially work. Antonin Scalia, who was both glib and a little abusive in his dissent, said things like, well, I now know that I'm ruled by a majority of this court instead of a majority of 320 million people. He also said, now, there's a guilty pleasure in reading Scalia dissents. It's like, getting a chocolate cake. Nobody knows you have a chocolate cake, and then the chocolate cake disappears. And you always feel bad about it later, right? And so Scalia's kind of the same. Scalia said, if I would have signed on to Justice Kennedy's opinion, I'd walk around with a paper bag on my head, right? They were vehemently opposed to the decision and said, please just let the state handle it. Justice Alito, and I will say up front, I agree with Justice Alito. He said, fine, the decision's been made, it should have been made in the states, but now potentially what we've done to the Constitution is begin to stretch it. Maybe stretch it beyond its intention, maybe stretch it beyond what it's ever intended to mean, and that can create very bad precedent. And I want to discuss that, and I'm not going to keep you for the whole time that I thought I'd keep you because it's getting warm in here and I may pass out in a moment. But I want you to think about this for a moment. What happens when we stretch the Constitution to cover things and then stretch it a little bit more? Is there a danger in that? Is there a danger in, and we may say, same-sex marriage is a good piece of public policy, it's a right, it's something that we should protect, but it's just not in the Constitution. Is that possible? Right? I would argue, from a legal standpoint, it's at least as it relates to marriage, it just maybe isn't there. But what happens when you begin to pull the Constitution? Let me give you a couple examples. James Madison would probably freak out seeing anything flying in the air. But what would he think about an aeroplane? How about an aeroplane taking photographs of your illegal pool in your backyard? How about a little tiny airplane with a little tiny camera being flown by somebody at a donut shop searching for things in the backyards of people? Little helicopter thing. Should we expand the Constitution to cover whether or not the President of the United States can use a bigger drone with not a camera but a gun to shoot somebody from the sky? Now, you might say, well, sure, if we're going to use it to restrain the power of the President, do you think that's what's going to happen? And we have to be careful here. The decision was for these are the three families that were affected directly by the decision. Obviously, millions of people around the country were affected. Mr. Obergefell lost his partner to a fatal disease. But, they're happy. That's great. Right? But should their happiness have come at a cost of the Constitution? Being stretched maybe too far. And I don't have an answer to that. But I think it's a question that we need to ask ourselves. Right? Because there's some things that happen. Skip. No. Yeah, that's boring. That's actually the First Amendment. That's probably not too boring. Let's skip. The clash. So there's a clash, or at least a potential clash, between now religious liberty and the protection of same-sex marriage found in the 14th Amendment. Flores in Washington State, right? Her business is going down. Just very recently found that she had a customer for like 9 years, sold him flowers, knew he was in a same-sex relationship. That gentleman then asked her to, Arlene Flowers, if you want to avoid it, or purchase flowers there. I forget what their city it's in. And she said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it." Right? Now, immediately we might say to ourselves, just do the wedding, or hey, just go someplace else. But that's not really the way this works, right? Same thing with a baker in Oregon, a photographer. What's going to happen, and this actually came up at the court's oral arguments, some of the conservative justices started asking the Solicitor General, Verrilli, what are you going to do with religious college institutions that discriminate on the basis of same-sex relationships? Are they going to get student financial aid? How many of you have seen that in a frightened sort of moment in the middle of the night when you're trying to get your stuff together in, I don't know, when did I do it, April or something? The FAFSA. Are you going to deny student loans to people who attend religious universities? How about tax exemptions? How about Kim Davis in Kentucky? We'll talk about her in just a second. Now, before you dismiss all of this, I was doing a presentation to a group of ministers and pastors, and the question came up, when will I be forced to marry people of the same sex? And then, of course, I, being a smarty pants Ivy Tower guy, I said, well, you won't be, because you have the protection of the Establishment Clause, which prevents the state from telling you what religion to adhere to, and you have the Free Exercise Clause, which allows you to practice your religion. And then he said to me, yeah, I know about those, but I also thought the state didn't have the power to define marriage either. And it took me aback, right? Now, I don't think anyone's going to be forced to marry anyone, but we go back to that stretching of the Constitution, right? And we want to make sure that we're protecting everyone's rights. Let's take a look at her real quick. I was going to show you a video, but they don't even show up. There she is, right? We're talking about her in class today, and I said, who is this? And someone said, the most horrible person in the world. Now, I don't think she actually meant it. In fact, I know she didn't, because she's probably out there, and I'm not going to stare at her. I know. But, right, how many of you saw on your Facebook and on the internet and the Twittery thing? I've done like 3 tweets. It's not going to happen. What was some of the vitriol about her? Now, I also come from northern Indiana, which is it's the Bible Belt, the suspender part of the Bible Belt. She's a hero. To other people, she is the personification of evil. Now, which one is she? Is she a woman standing up for her principles and her conscience? Or is she somebody willfully denying people their right to marry? She's a little bit of both. And that's a difficult one. How do we parse that out? What do we say to Bernadine at Arlene's Flowers? Right? And we had other, those people, the people you would never recognize, are the ones who are probably going to end up making this decision. Right? States have already begun reacting. They've passed a series of things called Religious Freedom Restoration Acts throughout the states. Remember the other map? Now look at this map. Now, some of you might be studying the statistics. Is there a correlation between this map and the Uter map? Right? And in a very interesting twist of things, the ACLU said in the Washington Post editorial 2 days after the case came down, we are no longer going to support REFRA at the national level. Right? This is an organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, that has made history defending minority religious groups. Nope, not going to do it anymore. Right? it's game on. And these states are ready to do battle. The ACLU is ready to do battle. Sweet Cakes by Lorraine is ready to do battle. All of these folks are ready to do battle. So what are we to take from all of this? The need for toleration is what we need. Right? You know, whether or not the Supreme Court made the right decision, whether or not the Supreme Court should have even heard the case, is immaterial. As we say in the law, the question is moot. Right? Doesn't matter anymore. We know there's legal toleration. Right? The next thing is to develop social toleration. And it's social toleration for all who are involved. Right? That we get beyond our dislike, our disgust, and our distaste for whomever. And we start to recognize that people have rights, that people can be accommodated, and that it's much better to sit down and talk these things through than to maybe file a law case. Right? You know, back when I was a younger man and I wore a younger man's clothes like knickers, I'm that old, we used to talk about the litigious society. Everyone's suing everyone. What would have happened if people just sat down and talked these things through without automatically rushing to the court to get their rights defended? I think what needs to happen is we need to have the courts and the government working together. And there's a few questions that I'm not going to ask you. So what's the future here? The future is, unlike some other issues, the court probably dodged a bullet here. Right? The track of history was towards accepting same-sex marriage. The court got in when 3/4 of the people in the United States live in states that already support same-sex marriage, and 31 states had already legalized it. The court came in, Justice Kennedy essentially said, "That's it. I've now discovered it in the Constitution. I didn't see it before in Lawrence versus Texas," and he said so. The court in 1972 didn't see it, but it's there now. Now, one of the dangers of the court doing this is people are not going to react to the actual policy, but they're going to react to the court and what the court's doing to the Constitution. This is exactly what happened after Roe versus Wade. Abortion was not a significant political, or it was a significant policy question to some, but it was not a significant political question until the U.S. Supreme Court made it one. And then days after the decision in Roe versus Wade, Catholic organizations and other religious organizations got together and formulated a series of groups that immediately took to the streets. And then on the other side, groups were formed to immediately take to the streets. Right? Would the abortion question have been different if the U.S. Supreme Court never would have made a decision? Probably yes. Right? And there probably, one scholar argues, and I pretty much agree with him, the number of abortions probably would be no different. We need the court to maybe exercise some self-restraint, and we need to understand what's actually in the Constitution. All right, so as we go forward here, there's going to be conflicts, there's going to be interactions, but in the end, I think we can pretty much guarantee that the answers are going to be answered. Most of us are going to be disappointed at times, but the secret is toleration. The secret is having a conversation. The secret is actually having society sit down. And my last thing I'm going to say is, maybe sometimes that's done better in a legislature and amongst an electorate than 5 justices at the U.S. Supreme Court. I will take 4 questions. 1, yes, I know it's hot in here. Right, we've answered that one. Ms. Rich.
What do you say to people in those states that aren't given the right? How long are they supposed to wait?
The answer, and that's a great question. That's the question everyone wants to ask. The answer is change the law. Bring about the pressure within the state. You go, well, it's Texas. Texas can be brought along as well. And that's the positive part of the court doing this is it's a national policy that applies to everyone. Goodbye. See you at the trial.